Welcome to the Mike Fave podcast. I'm your host, Ethan Wright, joined by Mike Fave. On this podcast, Mike and I help you make sense of the online health chaos while answering your individual health questions along the way. So if you have any health trends, topics, or questions you'd like to see us cover, please leave them in the comments below and we'd be happy to get them answered on future episodes. In today's episode, we are going to dive into cholesterol and cardiovascular disease by discussing, first, Dr. Peter Attia's controversial take on cholesterol and lipid-lowering strategies. Second, Dr. Ken Berry's take on carbohydrates raising triglyceride levels. And last but not least, the infamous Dr. Lustig telling us how sugar causes cardiovascular disease. Then from there, if we have time, we're going to get into rapid-fire questions from Mike's clients and private Revive community about cholesterol and cardiovascular disease. So before we jump in, Mike, let's provide some context based on what you and I are experiencing with the clients.
Yeah, so I think the overarching journey that I tend to see, and that I think when you're talking with people on discovery calls, what you're hearing from people specifically around cardiovascular disease and cholesterol is it's like relatively uniform amongst people. So we're seeing a very similar journey amongst all of these people. The first thing is, now, people will come in at different points, but in general, it tends to start with you go to your doctor, you get a checkup, cholesterol levels are high. Your doctor says, hey, I need you to go on a statin. I want you to go on a statin. And so then some people will be like, yeah, okay, I'll go on a statin. They go on a statin. Maybe they get side effects. Maybe they don't. If they do, maybe they want to change it. If they don't, then they continue. Or they go and do a little research. They type in YouTube, statins. And then usually they'll find like the alternative health sphere, the low carb, the keto, the carnivore, these different spheres, paleo. And what they'll see in these spheres is that they say that cholesterol doesn't cause heart disease. You don't have to necessarily worry about cholesterol. You have to worry about insulin resistance. That's the real problem. And so then the solution in those spheres is this low carb diet, right? The don't have any carbohydrates. And then it's like a funnel. So you start with, lower your carbohydrates, lower your sugar. And then all of a sudden, like a couple months later, now you're a full-blown carnivore. And I think both you and I had this experience.
Yeah, definitely. And I know just in talking with people, yeah, it's all or nothing. The doctor wants me to take a statin and the low-carb guy is saying, don't even worry about my LDL cholesterol. So it's a confusing perspective. It's a confusing problem that people, I think, are trying to tackle. And then, I think Bioenergetic tries to bring some sense to why both camps are saying these things. So maybe you can talk a little bit about like how that problem, that paradox is essentially solved, or that's going to be the goal, at least on the podcast for people.
I think it gets even more confusing before you even get to Bioenergetics. And Bioenergetics is just like, by the time people make it they're at the end of the funnel with Bioenergetics, they're like, oh, I don't even know anymore. So I think there's a step between Bioenergetics and the keto stuff. And that's when you start to see people like Dr. Peter Attia, who was a low carb advocate, who was doing low carb and keto and stuff like this at one point and fasting. And now he's like become like a pretty strong lipid hypothesis advocate, where he's basically saying like the major way to adjust the lipid panel and is to use pharmacologic agents. So there's things like statins, PCSK9 inhibitors, ezetimibe, etc. And the goal is to like craft a therapy with these pharmaceuticals to bring your lipid values down. And so we're seeing him talk about that. And it's kind of weird because he was in the low carb sphere, like he came out of the low carb sphere, but he's like low carb lipid hypothesis proponent. And I think that then it's like, where are we at?
Yeah.
With all of these different elements. And then you get to the Bioenergetics, and Bioenergetics talks about how metabolism is the central problem, which is, I agree with that perspective. And then you actually want to be able to oxidize carbohydrate instead of just, limiting carbohydrate and then just only oxidizing fat. And then if you ever add carbs on board, like God forbid, the goal is that you actually are able to use the carbohydrate now. But then I think people jump into the sphere, and this is what people are saying, is like they jump in, they gain weight, maybe lipids aren't as good, maybe insulin values or blood glucose isn't as good, it got worse, stuff like this. And I'm like, well, now I don't even know where I want to be, because they're like, I don't want to go back to keto. I don't want to go back to carnivore, paleo, this type of stuff. But I also know I can't stay where I'm at with the bioenergetic stuff. And the theory, this is what you tell me all the time, is like people are like, well, the theory makes so much sense, but I don't know how to implement it.
I mean, that's why if you're in bioenergetics and you listen to all the podcasts and you were low carb beforehand and you start adding in carbs because people on the podcast are saying, oh, you improve your thyroid health and you're going to lower your cholesterol values. And then you do that and you get your labs drawn again and your cholesterol levels are higher and maybe your triglycerides are higher, now that person's really in the spin cycle. So I think the goal is to bring clarity, try to walk the person through. I'm curious to get your thoughts on the steps that you take with those clients and like how you get them to achieve like the improvements in the lipid panel and metabolic dysfunction.
I mean, that's what we're going to cover today. We're going to use some interesting clips from like the different spheres to talk about this. But I think ultimately there's not really a paradox. I think there's an ounce of truth in each perspective, even within the lipid hypothesis perspective, in terms of cholesterol being involved in cardiovascular disease and then metabolic function being a core, like the major driver of cardiovascular disease. And then on top of that, like people not who have metabolic dysfunction having a more difficult time with carbohydrates. I think I also see that. So I think the alt health sphere has a percentage of truth in it. What Dr. Peter Attia is saying to some extent has a percentage of truth in it. And then also there's a percentage of truth inside the bioenergetic sphere. I think in the alt health sphere, the low carb, carnivore, paleo, these spheres, I think the fundamental understanding of insulin resistance and what's going on with mitochondrial function and oxidation of different fuel sources and stress hormones, I think there's like a lack of understanding there. I think with Dr. Peter Attia's lipid hypothesis perspective, I think it's very reductionistic and it tends to heavily focus on LDL as the major factor that we're looking at, or ApoB more specifically, instead of and like maybe not getting to like what are all of the other components that could be involved with these issues, and then like pharmacologic management being the major treatment. And in the bioenergetic sphere, I think part of the problem is the sphere is like, Ray's work is pretty detailed, it's pretty research heavy, and so it's not really extremely user friendly for a lot of people to read. So I think a lot of people are relying on interpretations of Ray's work instead of directly reading Ray's work. And then also Ray's work changed over time, and then the implementation around the bioenergetic stuff is also kind of like all over the map. So like people get there and they like get a sense of like, okay, like there's something here. The theories, the perspectives, they make sense. But then when it comes to implementation, it's like it's flat. Like I'm feeling better, but I'm gaining weight and I'm not happy about that. And then metabolic function is not ideal. So you can rectify all of these components and hammer out the paradoxes. And that's what our goal is here to do today. That's what I want to talk about specifically today, because I think it'll bring a lot of clarity for people so that they know what to do to a large extent with diet and lifestyle, and also understand why they're doing those things.
Yeah, why some of the things they may have experienced through the different dietary journey have happened. And that's going to be important to acknowledge as you come out of that and into like this new perspective.
Yeah.
With that said, should we jump into the first clip?
Yep, let's jump in.
Nutrition versus pharmacology as a way to lower lipids.
I believe that using nutrition to solve the lipid problem is not a good solution. I think use nutrition to solve the nutrition problem. Use nutrition to address energy balance, protein needs, anabolic structure, energy, all of these other things, and let your lipids fall where they may, because this is one of the few areas in medicine where we have amazing pharmacologic tools.
I'm curious, Ethan.
I'm a little confused with the let's use nutrition to solve the nutrition problem. I'm not exactly sure what he means by that.
When we're looking at lipids, right, fundamentally, what are we talking about? We're talking about cholesterol and triglycerides, right? Those are the major components that we're looking at. And it's all surrounded by what's going on with your diet. So to then say like, do your diet stuff, let things fall where they may fall. Then what we're going to do is like, we're just going to strong arm this with drugs because we have really good drugs, when the fundamental component that is adjusting what's going on with distribution of your fuel sources is the fuel coming in, like your diet. It's just a weird perspective to me. I don't really disagree with this at all. I think that one of the major drivers that we can look at for shifting the lipid panel, and I have an example here, is going to be diet, hands down. Are there genetic disorders and diseases that shift things because this specific enzyme doesn't work? Yes, of course. But for the vast majority of people, I think the fundamental problem is lifestyle, diet, metabolic function related. And those are the ways that you're going to fix it, not just like, let me just take all these drugs. Now, maybe the drugs can help in the meantime, depending on how it's working, what its mechanism is, etc. But I think like fundamentally, the ultimate root cause or root cure, barring genetic issues, is going to be diet, hands down.
Right. And like you're saying, you've had a lot of clients who had maybe high cholesterol or high triglycerides, and then modified their diet and seen improvement, right?
Yeah, significant improvement. We'll show an example.
Yeah. I mean, I think it would be good to show an example, but that is the first line of defense, essentially, like, or the first plan of attack, right? Would be to modify the diet.
Yeah. Stage one, like every person that we're working with, you're doing a discovery call with you, you're collecting the information, where are they at with their health? What do they have going on? After that, like I'm looking at lab work, I'm looking at their diet, I'm looking at their supplementation, I'm looking at their movement, I'm looking at the report that you wrote, and then we're putting everything together. We're hopping on a call. We're saying, this is the plan. This is the things that we're going to do to fix these specific problems you have going on. And the first thing is almost always diet. Now, some people need like a 180-degree turnaround, and some people need like a 10% change to what they're doing. But it's like step one is always diet.
I think it would be good to look at the lipid panel and then maybe talk about the interventions that like were made, or maybe you can explain like what are the first things that you're looking at. Is it the carbohydrate total intake, like the macronutrient ratios to adjust the cholesterol, or what are the modifications to the diet?
Let's pull up the lipid panel. And then just to answer the second portion of your question, even before we jump in, because I think it'll be relevant, what gets changed depends on that person's context. If the person has metabolic dysfunction versus their hypothyroid versus their keto carnivore lean mass hyperresponder versus they have, like a genetic situation going on, all of those things will shift what the recommendation is, because you have a different cause. So you're trying to figure out what is the underlying adjustment that needs to be made based on an individual's context, instead of saying like everybody just needs to go keto or carnivore, like hands down best strategy. It's like, where are you at? What do you have going on? Like with all the information that we can have, that you have available, can we sleuth out and figure out what's going on? And then that's where the adjustment is. So we'll look at this. This is one case study of a very specific example. So this one is going to be, I think, pretty shocking for a lot of people. This is one of my clients. I have an ApoB here. The ApoB at this point in time was 240 milligrams per deciliter. Now, ideally, it's less than 80. So this is 3 times the target that I would typically shoot for. ApoB is essentially the protein that the lipids, cholesterol, the fats are encased in. Because basically the fats, since they are fats, don't transport in water very well. And our bloodstream is water-based. So in order to move these fats around the body, we needed to have some transport mechanism that allowed them to mix. So you have these little particles, these little packages. ApoB is the protein that one of the major proteins that makes these packages. And basically what it does is it allows you to shift around the VLDL, IDL, LDL. And so you have one ApoB particle per like every package for the cholesterol. So when you're looking at ApoB, you're seeing how many particles your liver is putting out, how many lipoproteins your liver is putting out, because there's one ApoB for every lipoprotein that the liver is putting out. And so it's telling you how much efflux, how much output, how many Amazon trucks are leaving your liver at any point in time. And so in this case, for this individual, the ApoB level here is super high, like a lot of fat export from the liver, a lot of lipoprotein export from the liver, such that it's 3 times the target that I'm typically setting up for. Now, the next thing I will see is with that, the total cholesterol value is 796 milligrams per deciliter. Most people, the doctor wants you less than 200. This individual is 796. Pretty crazy lipid values. On top of that, LDL cholesterol by itself, so not even total, is 695. So it's almost 700 for the LDL. And then we're looking at HDL 65. So relatively speaking, the HDL value in ratio to the total cholesterol and to LDL is quite low. And then even worse than that is triglycerides are also high. So ideally, you want to see triglycerides at the minimum less than 150, but ideally less than 100. So we're even over the minimum target for triglycerides. This isn't technically a lean mass hyperresponder profile because of how high the triglycerides are.
And for those listening, it's 189, right?
Yeah, 189 milligrams per deciliter on the triglycerides. Total cholesterol, 796 milligrams per deciliter. And then the LDL cholesterol, 695 milligrams per deciliter, so almost 700 milligrams per deciliter, just LDL, and an HDL, 65 milligrams per deciliter. These are things that I look at that can be extremely important when looking at, if you just get a standard lipid profile, if you don't get ApoB, your doctor doesn't want to do ApoB or look at any of this type of stuff, or it's expensive, whatever the deal is, you can take a standard lipid profile and look at your cholesterol to HDL ratio, your triglyceride to HDL ratio, and then your LDL to HDL ratio. These values are not ideal. So I'm actually going to make a separate video going through the specific values that I look at. So stay tuned for that, like with all the labs to assess this type of stuff. But this is a key example of a starting place. So when I first started to work with this individual, this is the lipid panel that we first had to look at. This individual was on a low carb, high fat diet. And there is a potential that this individual had familial hypercholesterolemia on top of being on this low carb, high fat diet. And the fat sources in the diet here were mostly dairy fats. This individual also was not necessarily an older person. This person was somewhere around their 30s, in their early 30s. I don't want to give out too much personal information about this because this is one of my clients, but in general, this is probably the highest lipid panel that I've seen. And with the clients that I work with, I had people 400, 500, 600, but this one at 800 was like pretty high. And the drop that we got was pretty precipitous with just diet. So I want to show that next, but I'm curious if you have any questions about these lipid values.
That's pretty high. I was curious what kind of dietary setup they're on there, but if it's low fat, high fat, low carb, makes sense. Did you say the first step, right, is to figure out like what exactly is going on, like what's the cause? So obviously low carb diet, but then are you looking at other lab values as well?
When I first work with somebody, I'll get like a full health history, and I'll look at the diet, I'll look at their chronometer. If they have CGM data, I'm looking at CGM data, what drugs they're on, what supplements they're on, what's their activity level, what's their stress level, sleep status, all this type of stuff, age, everything, family history. Like I'm really trying to look at everything so I can see where are the problems or where are the potential problems. I don't try to get people to spend like $5,000 of lab testing up front, because that when that happened to me when I was sick, that like blew out all my savings. I really despise that. So what I usually tell people up front is like, what lab testing do you have? I'll take a look at that. I'll see what's going on. We'll see what's going on with lifestyle, diet, things like this. And then we'll see what further lab testing we need to do based on the information that we're given. And then we run from there. And it also depends on like how much money the person has for the testing, because a lot of stuff's not covered by insurance if you're looking at really in-depth markers. So I'm not really trying to, have somebody break the bank. I'm trying to work with what they can give me and try to get the outcomes, because just doing the diet and getting micronutrients under control, adjusting lifestyle, movement, like these things by themselves make a huge shift. And that's what I did for this individual. This individual did have metabolic dysfunction, like outside of the lipid panel. We're not talking about somebody who's like a normal, healthy metabolism. There are things that were going on there as well. And then we still saw the shift even by adding in carbs to the diet. So this was the follow-up lipid panel. It was about a couple months later. They didn't get an ApoB. But what you're seeing is the previous LDL was 695. Right now, it's 158. So that's like 1/4 of the LDL. There was no drugs used to lower this. We just shifted the diet, shifted the fat sources around, brought carbohydrates on board. The triglycerides, as an example, dropped from 189 to 74. And then HDL values actually picked up from the 65 to 122. 122 is on the higher side. I'd like to see HDL at least over 60. But this is like a pretty significant shift, because all those ratios that I talked about drastically shifted. This total cholesterol value is now 291 from the 796. So that's a huge, huge shift downward from where the previous values were.
Well, how long did that take to get the reduction?
This was on the order of months.
On months? Oh, wow. Okay.
It was literally within a couple months of bringing carbs on board, shifting the diet around. And the thing is, it could have happened sooner, but that was the pre-test, and then this is the post-test. So this was the next test that we had. So I don't know when exactly it shifted. This was just when we were able to get the next lab draw with the doctor so that the person could get it covered by insurance.
Using just diet.
Using diet and then like basic
Supplements.
supplementation. Like if you're vitamin D deficient, or if your folate or B12 is low, or if you need to bump your zinc up, or if you're iron overloaded. Like I'm looking at stuff like this. If you're, seeing what types of fats you're using in the diet, saturated versus monounsaturated, how much carbs you're having, is there issues going on with the liver? Is there issues going on with thyroid function? So I'm looking at is there stress, movement, activity levels? So I'm looking at all this stuff, and I'm just making adjustments to those areas. And a lot of times it's diet and lifestyle modification, and then targeted supplementation. And I don't prescribe or write drugs. So none of this is drugs. It's all lifestyle, diet modification, and supplements.
In the order, the first two things are adding carbs back in from the low carb diet, and then adjusting the composition of the fatty acids in the diet. Would you say that that's like the top two things to maybe look at?
Again, it's like person's contextually dependent. In this individual, they were running a low carb, high fat diet to like minimize how much insulin they had to use. And then it was really driving their lipids up. It was so high, I think it was in the background of either a heterozygous or homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, so like a genetic predisposition towards high cholesterol. And then on top of that, we were trying to troubleshoot the lipid panel because it obviously wasn't great, and the person was concerned, their doctor was concerned. And then we were also trying to adjust and manage the diabetes simultaneously, because one of the major strategies we did to bring this down was bring carbohydrate on board. It was like a tightrope to get that under control. And then once we got it, it was fine. And all this stuff started to really get under. But this was like, this person's situation was specific. When we look at the next one, we'll see that their dynamic is different. And so the strategies were different. So that's why we're looking at trying to get this full picture to see like, where do we need to make the adjustments? Like, what are the specific areas that need to be changed for the person? And then systematically work through it. So yes, it was diet. And then there was some, nutrients, micronutrient status. Is there stuff going on in the gut? What's going on with hormones, lifestyle components, and like try to systematically go about step by step adjusting those, and to make sure the person can do it over the long term, right? So they can implement it, because they have to maintain it going forward.
And to kind of bring it back to the clip with Peter Attia, what I'm hearing is just there's so many levers to pull within the diet before you jump to the pharmacological route, right? So it's not like, oh, I tried low carb and this is the case. This is like where my lipids, fell where they fell, and I need to go pharmacology. But there's like an order of things to look at. And like you're saying, getting to the cause is going to be like the most important thing on how you go about modifying the diet in that direction, right?
Exactly. And it will be person specific. Like, so it's like also ranking an order of priority on what you're going to address with somebody, like where are the biggest areas to get under control. So like, because it's not always so straightforward. Like, yeah, just add carbs on board and it solves all the problems. So that's why when I hear a clip like what Peter was saying, where he's like, oh yeah, like, just do what you're going to do with the diet, and then we'll just lower your lipids with drugs. It's real. That's very weird to me. It's a very weird perspective, because it's like you're talking about a system that is dependent upon what you're eating on a regular basis, barring very specific genetic disorders. And even then, what you're doing with your diet is going to have an effect, even in those genetic disorders, on what's going on with these profiles. First, adjust what's going on with your diet. If you adjusted things with your diet, you looked at all these other metrics, and then you get to a point where it's like you just have an obvious issue, and these other strategies haven't worked. Then you go to level 10, and then you start talking about the medications and components. Obviously, if your doctor prescribes something, please, by all means, it's not medical advice. Please speak and work with your doctor. But in general, like, I'm thinking about things in the tier, and I work with the doctors all the time. I'm working with a person and a doctor, and I like write out the strategies that I'm looking to use with the dietary adjustments and the supplementation. And then it's like, look, okay, it's not coming down. Okay, what is our next step? What is the next option from here? Because we ruled out this, and this.
Have you ever gotten to the point with a client where you've gone through everything and the lipids like still aren't coming down, and then you're considering like, oh, maybe there's a pharmacological intervention that's necessary? Or do you usually solve things prior to ever getting there?
When I'm looking at a lipid panel in general, and say I don't have ApoB, say I just have a basic lipid panel, because that's what most people have. I'm looking at what's your total cholesterol, sure. Then I'm looking at what is your LDL cholesterol, sure. But then the major markers that I'm really interested in, what are your triglycerides? Are they less than 100? What is your HDL cholesterol value? Is it greater than 60? What is your ratio of total cholesterol to HDL? Is that less than 3? And then I'm saying, what is your ratio of LDL to HDL? Is that less than 2.3? And then what is your ratio of triglycerides to HDL? Is that less than 1.9? And then on top of that, then I'm saying, where's your fasting insulin value? Is that around 5? Where's your blood glucose value? Your fasting blood glucose value, is that less than 90? Where is your uric acid value? Is that less than 6? Where are your ALT and your AST values? Are those less than 26? So I'm looking at multiple factors, and I'm trying to gauge based on those overarching factors. So if somebody's like, yeah, my LDL is 220, or not my LDL, my total cholesterol is 220. My LDL is like 100 and 120, but my HDL is 90 something. And then my another important marker is VLDL. My VLDL is less than 24, and my insulin is 5, and my ratio for total cholesterol to HDL is less than 3, and my ratio for LDL to HDL is 2, and then my ratio for triglycerides to HDL is 1.6. And I'm seeing stuff like this, and the other values are looking good, but LDL and HDL are a little bit high. I'm like, it's like I'm not as concerned about that value at that point because all of these other metrics that we have look pretty good overall. And even then, most times I'm able to get people to hit those targets. And I'm able to, the one thing that I haven't always been able to do is get total cholesterol values less than 200 and total LDL values less than 100. I've been able to shift all the ratios, get the insulin values down, fasting blood glucose, but sometimes the cholesterol will hover 210, 220, and then the LDL will be bumped up over 100. But then even then I've seen ApoB values come down, even though the LDL is bumped up a little bit and stuff like this. So there's been times where that hasn't happened, and it's up to the person. It's like, well, we have all these risk factors. And then you present the report. And it's like, here's a report, like, see what your doctor wants to do. Does your doctor want to go with pharmacologic management given these values? Do you want to go with pharmacologic management given these values and these risk factors, like where these components are? And then it's the person's personal decision on whether they want to move in that direction from that point. And it's like, well, based on these values, based on where all these things are okay, these things look good, these are the problematic areas. And then also it's like, can we make further adjustments? Like a lot of times you can make further adjustments with dietary components and supplements and stuff like this, but you don't always, like some people are like, yeah, like I'm happy. I'm like, I was at 800 and now I'm at like 200 and 290 and my trend is still coming down on my values. So I'm really happy with that. And I don't know if I don't really want to be on the statin. I understand the risk. And so then that's a personal decision because it's ultimately the person's personal decision. Between them, they have to make it. They talk to their doctor. And then I'll share research studies and papers and go and like give the analysis on these different data points, say like, here's what I think overall. And then you got to, present it to your doctor. You guys come to a decision on what exactly you want to do.
And I think most of the people that we talk to on a consistent basis are less so interested in the statin, and they're more interested, at least off the bat, right? And more so interested in seeing what they can accomplish using some of the dietary strategies that you're talking about and positioning it as like, you just do your diet and let everything kind of fall where it falls because you have these awesome pharmacological things that you could implement if things don't work out, is like kind of taking the ball like out of their court a little bit, It's like, no, there's a lot to try here. Like, let's run through some of these options, see how you feel, look at these other markers that you're mentioning before, and then get a total assessment of like what's going on, big picture. And then, and then I guess the discussion with you to figure out like where to go from there. But yeah, that all makes sense. So the next clip that we have here is of Ken Berry talking about how carbohydrates raise triglycerides. And I know based on some of the people that I talked to on the calls, they will say that they came into bioenergetics hoping to improve some of the lipid panels in triglycerides. And then they add carbohydrates in and they see a bump in triglycerides or maybe sometimes even a bump in cholesterol. So let's get Ken Berry's opinion, and then Mike will get your response on why someone could be experiencing that after adding in carbohydrates and go from there.
That's important because having elevated triglycerides, hypertriglyceridemia, can increase your risk of heart attack, heart disease, and stroke. If your triglycerides are high enough, they can actually increase your risk of a life-threatening condition called pancreatitis. The most important concept that I want you to take away from this video is that eating fat does not raise your triglycerides. And then specific kinds of carbohydrates, that's what leads to hypertriglyceridemia. So tip number one is to decrease your total carbohydrate intake. Other people, and it's probably people who have that genetic predisposition I talked about earlier, they have to cut the carbohydrates even more.
So maybe just start with like why, well, first of all, is fat like, not going to raise your triglycerides? Or like, what is the relationship between fat intake and triglycerides?
Typically when somebody goes on a high fat, low carb diet, triglycerides drop and then LDL and HDL will increase. Again, what's happening is the body, so triglycerides are fats. They're fats floating around in the bloodstream. When you don't have the carbs coming in, the body starts to use those fats. And then also the body starts to raise the HDL, LDL values because it's starting to transport fats to the tissue from the liver. So yes, triglycerides tend to drop when you go low carb. Now, if you have metabolic dysfunction, even if you go low carb, and you say you're not losing weight with it and whatever, like you can still see triglycerides high. And I have an example here of a client who was low carb, type 2 diabetic with high triglyceride values and a not so great lipid profile. So we'll talk about that. Now, when you switch from a low carb diet to a higher carb diet, you can see a bump in triglycerides, at least initially. And the reason why is because your body starts to use the carbohydrate, which leads to more triglycerides being pushed in the bloodstream. And also the triglycerides can move to the liver, be packaged in VLDL, or the fats that aren't being used can be moved to liver, packaged in VLDL, and bump VLDL up, at least initially. Now, if that's when you first switch from low carb to higher carb, you can see it LDL and HDL drop. Maybe VLDL can bump a little bit and triglycerides can bump a little bit. But as things improve, metabolic function improves, those things should continue to come down. So even as an example for myself, my triglycerides are less than 100. I think they're less than 70 or 80 on my last blood test, but I'm having 450 grams of sugar per day. So the idea that the general idea of like, oh, you eat carbs, the carbs are going to create fat production at the liver, and then the fat production at the liver is going to, de novo lipogenesis is going to lead to this bump in triglycerides. But what they're not actually clear on, that's the mechanism. Because when they look at the metabolic, the isotopic tracer studies, or they're looking at when they feed people a bunch of carbs, or they're looking at the panels, they're not sure, is it because the body starts to oxidize the carbohydrate and then you get an increase of triglycerides and fats in the bloodstream, and LDL, HDL do drop when you add in carbs. It's another thing. Or LDL tends to drop when you add in carbs. HDL may drop, depending on the person, a little bit when you add in carbs, because now you're using that carbohydrate instead of this fat. You're switching your fuel. And then the triglycerides get left in the bloodstream, and then also, they can go to the liver. And then the increase in de novo lipogenesis, which they don't see directly from the carbohydrate, could be from the fatty acids going to the liver, and the liver packaging up and exporting them back out. So it's not necessarily that you are seeing the carbs being converted directly to fat and then bumping up triglycerides. There could be other explanations for why that's occurring. When you're first low carb and then you go into higher carb, you can see initial bump, and then it should come back down as your body transitions into using those carbohydrates. Now, another thing that's really important to understand here, if you have metabolic dysfunction, right? Say you're type 2 diabetic, say you're insulin resistant, pre-diabetic, fatty liver, whatever the deal is, you will get bumped triglycerides, bumped LDL cholesterol, bumped total cholesterol, and low HDL cholesterol. That is a different profile than the high LDL, high HDL, low triglycerides of a lean mass hyperresponder, or even the normal lipid profile, somebody who's just generally healthy, not doing low carb or anything like this, where you see a normal cholesterol, normal HDL, triglyceride, like everything looks normal across the board. The goal state, from my perspective, is to be able to have a normal cholesterol value, normal HDL, normal LDL, and then also be able to tolerate carbohydrate. So you don't want to be in a state where you can't tolerate carbs and it's bumping them up. It's usually indicative of metabolic dysfunction in general. So you see people who are, even when they're like in a low carb diet, they're still driving, they still have metabolic dysfunction. You can still see triglycerides bumped up, and I've seen that quite a few times. Now, when you go keto, carnivore, whatever, and you start losing weight because you're in a caloric deficit, because your appetite is knocked out, you're eating one meal a day, you're fasting, whatever else, you see improvements in metabolic function. But if you're on a high carb diet and you also lost weight, you would still see improvements in your lipid panel, your triglycerides, and everything as well. So general weight loss and improved metabolic function will fix the lipid panel as well. And then whether you're high carb or if you're higher carb, it'll bring down HDL and LDL. If you're lower carb, it'll bring down triglycerides, but there'll be a shift, because what you're seeing is a shift in fuel utilization in the body. Because again, blood glucose, blood fats, and the arteries and veins, they are basically pipelines to the tissues from the liver. And you're seeing changes in which fuel source is being used peripherally and which fuel source is being distributed based on what fuel source you're bringing in.
And then when you are saying that the triglycerides initially go up after someone adds in carbohydrates, what is the typical time frame there? Like how long would be considered like a normal response versus, oh, we have a problem?
Generally, what will happen if you set up the diet appropriately, not I'm going to come into Bioenergetic and eat unlimited ice cream and unlimited sugar in the milk and just like drink orange juice all day long, like every hour, just another glass, like stuff like this, and tons of dairy. If you set up the diet appropriately, which on the website, there's a nutrition blueprint. This is what we're doing in the course, all this stuff, like very specific in granular detail, what I do with it. You will see within you should see maybe initial bump and then it comes back down. So maybe after a month or so, or 2 months, especially if things are set up well, it'll come back down. Your lipid panel should ultimately drastically improve. And I'm going to show an example here in just a second, but it should change very quickly. Especially say you are overweight, type 2 diabetic, fatty liver, whatever the deal is, you start to drop that weight and your diet is set up where you have enough protein, you have enough carbs, enough fat. It's not that you have to be low fat. You just have to have enough of each of those things. And we'll talk about the targets and the blueprint and whatnot. And then say you're losing weight and metabolic function starting to improve, you'll still see triglycerides come down on a high carb diet. And I have an example of this here. And the last one as well, the triglycerides were 189. If we look here, so the first triglycerides for this person was 189 milligrams per deciliter, right? That was on a high fat, very low carb ketogenic diet, right? So still has high triglycerides. Why? Because there's metabolic dysfunction. It's not because of the fats or whatever else, it's because of the metabolic dysfunction in and of itself. And then when you come back over here and we look at the follow-up panel, triglycerides are 74. So they're less than 100. It's ideal. Adding in carbs, I think it was like 200 or 250 grams of carbs a day in a diabetic. So we're seeing that improve. So it's not just that carbs drive high triglycerides. Metabolic dysfunction drives high triglycerides, and you can have transient bumps and changes with triglyceride values as you change your context. And then also even post-meal, you'll bump triglycerides and stuff like this. But your fasting triglycerides, if everything is going well metabolically, will be low. So the fundamental goal is get to a good metabolic state.
Okay, so what about for someone who adds in the carbohydrates and maybe their metabolic state isn't great? So they get the longer term elevation of triglycerides, like more than the month, and then maybe even a bump up in LDL. I know it's probably contextual on how you start to attack that, but what are the things that you would start to look at, given that circumstance?
This person is a type 2 diabetic on insulin and hypothyroid and hypogonadal, right? So it's like, oh, you can't have carbs if you have metabolic dysfunction. It's like there's 3 types of metabolic dysfunction going on here, and fatty liver. So we have diet. We know there's fatty liver, right? So this is the initial panel. This was in November of 2023, right? And we see these values are because of what's going on at the liver. These are liver values. So you have ALT, AST. These are the ALT is specific to the liver. This person's not exercising, so you're not seeing this because of exercise. Alk phos specific to the liver. So the albumin globulin ratio, bilirubin values are at the top end of the range. So we're seeing, okay, the liver is not super happy here. And we know there's fatty liver in this context. Then the lipid panel, we're not seeing 900 on the cholesterol, but total cholesterol is high. But the big deal here is that the triglycerides are high, the HDL is quite low, and then the LDL is high. So the ratio is pretty bad, right? The LDL to HDL ratio here is 4.1. We want that less than 2.3. That is the ideal target. When we're looking at total cholesterol, you have 237 divided by 39. You have a 6-to-1 ratio of total cholesterol to LDL cholesterol. We want it less than 3. So even though the total value is not really that bad, it's over the target, you want less than 200. The ratios and breakdown of this is metabolic dysfunction. This is, in air quotes, atherogenic dyslipidemia on top of fatty liver, on top of diagnosed insulin-dependent type 2 diabetes, on top of diagnosed hypothyroidism. I'm not showing all the values, on top of low testosterone or borderline hypogonadism. So we're seeing all of this, this person, they were on a low carb diet, a keto diet for a while, and their insulin usage, their metabolic function not great. They're trying to figure out how to add in carbs. So this was like mid-range. So they had this profile already, and then the adding in carbs wasn't going super well with what they were doing. And so then that's when they reached out to me like, Mike, like, what do I do? How do I adjust this diet? How do I bring the carbs on board? My insulin usage is not great. My weight is not great. So let's see the follow-up panel. So the follow-up panel, we can see this was in May 2024. So you have so we started working together basically in November, December. So December, January, February, March, April. So 5 months. Total cholesterol down to 141 from 237. HDL stayed around the same. We weren't able to fully bump it up. The LDL value down to 81. So the previous LDL value that we had was 161. And now the current LDL value that we were able to get it down to is 81. Triglycerides went to 143. And the triglycerides here were 198. So 50-point drop in trigs. And then the VLDL here was 28. And then here, the VLDL, which is another important marker, is 37. So about a 9-point drop in VLDL, about almost a 100-point drop in total cholesterol, a significant 80-point drop in LDL cholesterol. HDL cholesterol dropped by 8 points, but it's so basically in ratio, not really that bad overall. And then the ratios improved. So our previous total cholesterol to HDL ratio, I think it was 234 divided by 39. So it was 6. This current one is 4.5. So we improved the ratio by 1.5. So we still had ways to go at this point, but everything significantly improved. And then I want to show here, when we're looking at these values, ALT, AST now in range. So the liver cleared out. We were working on clearing out the fat in the liver, and we're seeing that ALT here is 91, AST here is 42 at the start. And then when we finished, we didn't finish, but what in like at this halfway point or this 3/4 of the way point, ALT went down to 16, AST went down to 19, alkaline phosphatase is at 93 here, and the previous alkaline phosphatase was 143. And we're seeing bilirubin was at 1.1 before, total bilirubin. And now the current total bilirubin is at 0.5. So the liver function improved. The lipid profile looks significantly better. The changes that we made to their diet here was we added in carbs, we moderated fat intake. Because what they were doing was they were eating high fat, and then they were trying to add the carbs on top and not adjusting the fat intake. And then they were already having metabolic dysfunction. They were already overweight at this point. They were already having a higher body fat than was ideal. And then so the panel wasn't looking good, insulin sensitivity wasn't looking good, and then adding carbs on top of the high fat wasn't ideal. So we figured out what was the caloric intake they needed. Then we figured out how much fat do we want them to run with, how much carb do we want them to run with. We need to clear out the liver, so we adjusted the carb sources overall, and we switched towards some starchier sources that were higher in glucose, so that we didn't put pressure on the liver with too much fructose. We still had some present. Even now, like we have some fruits set up in the diet with tubers and things like this. And then at some points we even had popcorn. It's just like not super, like it was a good quality popcorn. So basically this was how we started to adjust things. And also the person in this time frame with the carbohydrate intake, I think was somewhere around 200 to 225 grams. This person had lost around, I think at this point in time, roughly 80 pounds. So he dropped 80 pounds. We improved the lipid profile significantly. We dropped the insulin usage, and we did this with carbohydrates on board, and the triglycerides still dropped, even though we bumped up carbs. The initial carbohydrate intake, I think, was around 100 grams. We doubled it.
I mean, it's just another example, right, of like how getting the foundation covered can really move the needle. And I feel like in talking with people, sometimes they go, oh, my diet's solid, like I do grass-fed meat and this kind of stuff. And then when I try to probe a little deeper, like, are you tracking the ratios of macronutrients and things like this? They're typically not. And then one of the things you just mentioned there was like having the same fat intake that maybe you had on a low carbohydrate diet, and then adding carbs in on top of that, but not really realizing that that's what's going on is like one of the mistakes you talked about last time. And that's probably oftentimes what you see in a situation like this, right, too.
When the system's not working, so say, as an example, say you have a car, say the engine on the car is shot, like the thing is dead. If I just start like flooding the engine with tons of gasoline, does that fix the problem? No. So I need to try to fix up the areas of the engine that don't work, get it running again. Don't flood it with fuel. Try to put in enough fuel to start to test it, see how it's going to run, get things working and under control, and then move from there. So that's what I'm looking to do. It's not just like, yeah, if you come on board, you slam orange juice and sugared milk and whatever else that people are thinking about, like it's just going to all get better. It's like, no, if things are broken, once the system is broken, it's more effort, more energy, requires more strategies to fix. As things get better and you fix it, you start tolerating these things. Things start getting back to normal. The engine starts to process stuff a lot better. And so that's the ultimate, that's what has to happen. You have to put interventions in place to fix things. It's 2 times as hard to fix something, and it's half as hard to maintain something. If it's already good and you're just maintaining it, it's way easier than if it's broken and you gotta fix all the little broken pieces with it.
My next question would be, with this person in particular, or any of the clients that are in a similar state, how much of an emphasis are you putting on exercise?
The first client that we talked about, we just said to do walking.
Walking, okay.
The second client, for the first all the way until May, I don't think we did any exercise besides trying to get the person to go for a walk after meals. And then eventually we would start, because like the person had lost significant amount of weight, a lot of body fat. And I wanted to start to build up the lean body tissue, the muscle mass, because it'll improve insulin sensitivity and it'll improve a lot of these markers as well. So then we did the workout routine. But by May, I don't think at that point that we really had that much exercise stuff going on, just walks. And then I think also the individual was doing rebounding and stuff like this here and there, but it wasn't super consistent. But this person had already lost over 60 pounds without doing any like concerted exercise at a gym. It was just diet, and they were already a type 2 diabetic on insulin, and they were already hypothyroid and like diagnosed hypothyroid, not by me, by another doctor, and on thyroid medication on top of using insulin and type 2 diabetic. So that's what I'm saying. Like, you can have metabolic dysfunction and just getting the diet and lifestyle stuff dialed in. I'm not saying that's the only thing to do. There's multiple levers. There's diet, there's sleep, there's subs, there's drugs, there's hormones, there's exercise, there's light exposure. There's all of these things you can do. But just even like for me, it's diet first. Just doing that can make a huge difference in a variety of values. And I mean, you saw that here. These are 2 case studies.
It's just interesting to hear that can be accomplished without having to like kill yourself in the gym or something like this. Like, you're losing weight and improving metabolic markers and lipid panels and all this kind of stuff, which I feel like a lot of people may be hesitant to like start like trying to make progress on this stuff, or maybe just go the pharmacological route because they feel like it's going to be this massive investment in terms of getting in the gym and doing like lots of cardio to lose the body fat and whatever. And it's like, what I'm hearing from you is if you set the diet up appropriately, have the foundations in place, and then make it so that you can be consistent with it, that's how you can achieve the results. And it doesn't have to involve like doing the Stairmaster for hours on end or anything like this. It can be simple walks and things like that in that nature. So
I don't even recommend that people go do a bunch of cardio. If people are going to go to the gym, my recommendation is to lift to build muscle tissue, not just to go like try to burn calories or something like this. Like, go build muscle tissue. But even then, when I'm building out workout routines, a lot of people are surprised. It's like, wait, but I'm not out of breath. And it's like, I don't feel bad after. I feel pretty good after like I'm actually enjoying it. And it's like, because if you set the diet up, if you set the diet up appropriately, then what happens is when you're losing the weight, you shouldn't really feel that hungry or starved. You're not going to feel starved. You shouldn't really feel, maybe you'll be slightly hungry, but that's about it. And it'd just be like one time and it's not really that big of a deal. Maybe you have some berries or something like this, but you won't really feel that you're in a huge deficit and you feel terrible. And then we just adjust. Like, I'm there along the way. And then when it comes to the exercise, it's the same thing. When you're looking at certain metrics, like how much volume of exercise do you need per week? How many sets per body part per week do you need to do in order to build muscle tissue? That's what you need to know. And then the next question after that is, how close to failure do you need to get? So how intense do those exercises need to be? How frequently do you need to hit those muscle groups? And how much rest time do you have between them? So we're looking at these very specific metrics. It's the same thing with the diet. How much calories, how much protein, how much carbs, how much fat, how much are you having per meal? How are you organizing it across the day? Getting into the nitty gritty of that is where you see the progress and the huge benefit. And then the supplements and everything else is additive into that. So now, instead of just relying like, well, yeah, your lipids suck, so just go on this drug regimen. It's like, why don't we harness diet? Why don't we harness exercise? Why don't we harness the supplementation? Why don't we, if you have to harness pharmacology, why don't you harness pharmacology and take this multi-pronged approach and hit all of these things and get them very specifically dialed in, and then see, am I getting the outcome? And then track the outcome and then see those outcomes improve. That's, for me, that's how I'm looking to gauge things, how I'm looking to see the benefit is like, when I look at this person, did he lose 70, 80, 90 pounds? Yeah. Did he improve his values across the board? Yeah. Do we still want to see things improve further? Yeah. I want better targets. I want those ratios underneath my ideal thresholds. And then it's on autopilot and the person just has to run it. That's the hardest part of the whole game is just consistency.
So when you are trying to track these things as you're making the interventions, is there a typical timeline that you like to see to make sure things are heading in the right direction? I know you have to take into consideration what's available to the person, but ideally, this person comes to you, you make the interventions. Is it, let's look at the labs and get them redrawn in 3 months, 2 months, 6 months? Like, what would be the ideal time frame?
I'm gauging based on how much resources, like how much money do people want to put towards this? I don't get kickbacks for any of the labs. Like, there's no kickback to me, but the lab testing is expensive in general because you want to get a full view of what's going on. So if the person has a lot of resources and they really want to like spend the money to figure this out and trend the stuff, then we can do it on a more reasonable time frame. You can find a bunch of other metrics to look at that aren't always lab values. Are you losing weight? Are you sleeping through the night? What's going on with your blood pressure? How much insulin are you using per day? And you can see like in the meantime, is all of this getting better? So it's like looking at things like this, like very specific for the target and based on the person's context, adjusting timelines.
You want to have the time to see the changes get made, right? You don't want to go be getting labs like necessarily every 2 weeks or something like that. Give things time to play out and make sure you're on the right track. I just think with people like getting the feeling like they're moving in the right direction is always a huge motivator for them to be like staying consistent and stuff like that. So having something where they know like, oh, I'll get these things checked like on a consistent basis, or even if it's just like, yeah, how many naps am I taking? Things like this. It's helpful to be like, you know, this is working. I'm moving in the right direction and whatnot.
When people see that weight move down on the scale, like even if the other lab values are not perfect, like for me, I'll be looking there and like, yeah, your weight came down. It's great. But like, I really want to see this be here. And they're like, I look great.
I'll do that one later.
Yeah. So they're like, if you can't do labs all the time, find other metrics in the meantime and still trend some progress. If you don't see progress within a couple weeks of starting to make the interventions, whether that's in some way of how you feel, how you're sleeping, your energy levels, your blood pressure, your weight coming down, like if you're not seeing that within a couple weeks, you need to make a change with what you're doing. It doesn't need to be a complete 180-degree change, but you may have to make a 5 or 10% change to what you're doing because maybe you're not hitting that threshold that's required to get the outcome.
And the 5 or 10% can make a huge difference too. And even if it's diet or lifestyle, right? Like there's a lot of 5 or 10% adjustments that you can make in diet or lifestyle that will really make a massive difference, you know? And it's not just that, oh, your diet's good, like pharmacology, boom, next.
Yeah.
You know, so
maybe we jump into our last clip here, our last clips here of the day.
So when you measure your triglyceride in the fasting state, you are actually looking at how your liver handles the carbohydrate and in particular the sugar in your diet, because those VLDLs, those triglycerides, they are what your liver does with sugar. It turns sugar into fat and packages it as VLDL. And then those VLDLs offload elsewhere and become the small, dense LDL. And if the goal is to get rid of the small, dense LDL, that means you got to get rid of the sugar because that's what made it. So by understanding what each of these species are and how one goes to the other, then you can look at a lab slip and understand the evolution of those species in a photograph. And so you can basically figure out what happened where, which process is going on, and therefore what you need to do about it.
So, yeah. I mean, this clip kind of reminds me of the one that you responded to on Paul Saladino's podcast, where Lustig was talking with Anthony Huberman. He just goes, fructose just wants to be fat. He's like, it just craves, being fat.
The way that he describes the process is not exactly how it works. And I kind of hinted at this already, but I want to show a graphic here really quick because I think this exemplifies things pretty well. These are from isotropic tracer studies. So basically they give people tagged carbohydrate, like, fructose. They'll give them a tagged bolus of this. So it's tagged with a radio label so that they can track where the components from the fructose move throughout the body. And then basically what they show is that, most of the fructose gets converted to glucose and lactate, a percentage to glycogen and glycerol, but less than 1%. And the reason I'm highlighting fructose here is because fructose is considered more lipogenic than glucose. And that's the major thing that people like, Dr. Lustig or Richard Johnson or a lot of the low carb docs rail against, but most of the fructose is not converted to lipids at the liver. And they say the data are obtained within study periods less than or equal to 6 hours. So this is what's happening like 6 hours after you ingest or are given fructose. So this is between 50 to 150 grams of fructose. They're giving really high dosages in these studies basically to see what happens. So you're not really seeing a lot of fat production from the fructose, even in purified fructose forms in a variety of these studies. Now, the thing though that does happen is you can see, as we talked about, the bump in triglycerides. And the bump in triglycerides is not necessarily because of fructose just going to the liver and making a bunch of fat. But again, we're talking about shifting fuel substrate. What winds up happening, you're taking in the carbohydrate, the substrate is being shifted, and you may get more triglyceride being left in the bloodstream, or you may have, change in what's going on with lipid panel and stuff like this because of the changing of the substrate and less because the fructose just converted to fat. And I want to make a point here. It's like, people like, oh, the fructose, it gets converted into fat. It's like, what does it get converted into? Like palmitic and stearic acid. So it's like, you are just going to eat that if you're eating butter anyway. You're just going to eat if the liver is producing that fat, you would be eating that fat if you were eating the fat anyway. And so basically, so it's like a weird argument for me. Where it's like, well, don't eat fructose because it gets converted to fat. Just eat a whole bunch of fat. That's already the fat that you have. He talks about how it raises small dense LDL. We didn't see that with the last client that we had the example from. You can see a bump in small LDLP with metabolic dysfunction. So I would say the small LDLP with like bump in triglyceride, like a high levels of triglycerides in general and super low HDL values, those overall tend to be related to metabolic dysfunction. And I think that overall metabolic dysfunction is associated with this lipid panel changes and with cardiovascular disease by itself. And so you're seeing this like hodgepodge mix of things. And then in the state of metabolic dysfunction with the shifts in these lipid panels, now you're in a state where your metabolism is not working well. You have a high amount of oxidative stress. And then you have these lipoproteins that are floating around. They're not being used. They're sitting in circulation for a longer period of time, exposed to oxidative stress because of the metabolic dysfunction. And now you're getting oxidized lipoproteins, which can be directly a driver and involved in atherosclerosis. And then also in metabolic stress, you also have the rise in inflammatory mediators and immune signaling, which also drives atherosclerosis. And you also have a rise in stress hormones like catecholamines, aldosterone, the RAS system, and glucagon and stuff like this, which also drives the cardiovascular disease and atherosclerosis. So you're seeing like all of these things, and it's a whole profile coming together. It's not so simple, this like very linear logic, carbs increase, small LDL, and that's cardiovascular disease. Like that's not how it works. So I think if you had a metabolically healthy person, they were flowing the fuel through very nicely, the carbs and fats, both of them to ATP when you take it in a diet, you're not going to see huge bumps in small dense LDL. You're not going to see huge bumps in triglycerides because the substrate is being used perfectly fine. But if the substrate's not being used perfectly fine, then you start to see you're taking a measure of the fuel in the pipelines and you're saying, well, look at let's see what happened with the fuel. And you're saying, okay, well, the fuel mixture here doesn't look good. Like there's some problems going on and it's damaging the pipeline. And it's like, yeah, because the fuel sitting in there is not getting turned into energy. So it's getting old. It's getting old, it's getting oxidized, and it's driving inflammation and damage to the pipelines. So you need to have the flow working effectively overall, and I think the metabolic dysfunction is a primary driver. And again, it's not that the fructose or carbs just go drive liver fat production. Even in the animal models, in order to get fatty liver, it's not just a high carb feeding. There's a bunch of factors: choline, methionine deficient diet, high fructose plus high fats, isolated fructose plus high fat plus choline methionine deficient diet. So there's multiple factors coming together to create this problem. It's a multifactorial issue centered around bottlenecks and problems at metabolism, not just carbs, small dense LDL, boom, cardiovascular disease.
And that's kind of like where the sort of solution, right, to the paradox kind of lies, right, is in the metabolic function. No, because I mean,
yes, exactly.
In the lean mass hyper-responder models, that's why you see the triglycerides or the fatty acids being like used as fuel in that situation, because that person is somewhat like metabolically healthy. Like, you would classify that person as metabolically healthy, right?
I have an example here. This is from a paper. It's called Effects of Dietary Carbohydrate on Triglyceride Metabolism in Humans. They say here, one example of data is from 34 patients with coronary artery disease who are switched to a diet very high in carbohydrates, 76%, with almost no fat, 8% of energy. So 76% energy of carbohydrates, 8% of energy fat. For the group as a whole, the average plasma triglyceride concentration did not increase significantly from the baseline diets, although a highly variable response was noted in the data of individual subjects. Those with a body mass index greater than 28 kilograms per meter squared, so like a high body mass index, a high BMI, experienced a 30% increase in triglyceride concentration, whereas those with a BMI less than 28 experienced no change. These data demonstrate that certain characteristics, e.g. BMI, can make some individuals more sensitive to lipid and lipoprotein changes when dietary carbohydrates increase. Is it BMI, or is BMI a proxy marker for metabolic function here? And you're seeing that when people have issues flowing the fuel sources through and they're storing it, so they're having higher BMIs or whatever the deal is, then you're starting to see problems. Now, if you have a high BMI because you're Arnold Schwarzenegger and Mr. Olympia, like that's very different than a high BMI because you're holding a large amount of body fat percentage. Now, in this same paper, they go on to say, the second source of fatty acids for very low density LDL or very low density lipoproteins and triglyceride synthesis de novo lipogenesis could be stimulated by an excess flow of glucose through the glycolysis pathway and into the hepatic acetyl coenzyme A pool. So basically, the carbohydrate can flow to become acetyl-CoA, and the acetyl-CoA can increase through, there's metabolic pathways there, to be produced to VLDL, that VLDL cholesterol, and triglyceride synthesis. But they say here, we measure the contribution of both free fatty acids and de novo lipogenesis, so the production of fats from carbohydrates, to VLDL triglyceride synthesis in healthy men before and after 5 weeks of isoenergetic high carbohydrate feeding, in which the diet was rich in polysaccharides, so complex carbohydrates and high in fiber. We found no evidence that carbohydrate-induced hypertriglyceridemia resulted from elevated free fatty acid flow or de novo lipogenesis. The primary phenomenon of carbohydrate-induced high triglycerides could be explained by a 37% reduction in triglyceride clearance from the blood. So when you switch them to a high-carb diet, they stopped burning as much fats, which left more triglycerides in the bloodstream. Not that they just started automatically converting all those carbs into fats and then exporting them out of the liver as triglycerides or VLDL. So again, it's not as simple as eat carbs, produce liver fat, put it in the bloodstream. It's eat carbs, use carbs, less fat gets burned, you see it back up, and then that will change things downstream. But you're seeing in people who are not overweight, who are metabolically healthy, it doesn't create a problem again, because the fundamental issue is not carbs or fats. It's not either or. You have people on high fat, low carb diets who improve metabolic function, and you have people on high carb, low fat diets who improve metabolic function. It's metabolic function is the central piece of all of this. And we're measuring indirect values in the bloodstream, the pipeline of seeing how fuel is being distributed, and then trying to see, well, is it this one thing or this other thing? It's like, it's fundamentally what's going on with metabolism, and everything else is downstream or backlogged from that.
And that's why you're saying there's the gap in time, because it's the switching of the fuel sources that has to take place. And the gap is short as long as that person is metabolically healthy. My question would be, is like a lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, like why would that person be motivated to say like, stop consuming a high fat diet if technically they're metabolically healthy and they're transporting the fats through the cholesterol and this kind of stuff? Like what would be your case to that person to be like, hey, maybe it's better to switch fuel sources like to glucose? Are there markers you're looking at? Or is that person technically, because in that state, would a lean mass hyperresponder technically be like physiologically insulin resistance, right? But maybe not pathological? Or how are you looking at that?
If you have somebody who's a lean mass hyperresponder and like say they're oxidizing primarily fatty acids, then yes, they are physiologically insulin resistant. So if you throw carbs in, there's going to be a period of time where they're not going to be as good at using them because their body is relying on fats. But it doesn't mean it's pathology. The pathology is different. When you're doing a high fat, low carb diet, your body is like, okay, we're going to do this fat thing. And if you're healthy metabolically, like you'll do the fat thing and then probably be fine. A lot of people are like, yes, fine. If you do a high carb, low fat diet and you're like doing your body's going to get really good at using the carbohydrate. If you're healthy, it's like, yeah, we're doing the carb thing. When you're metabolically impaired, this middle person is like, they're not doing anything. They're not doing the carbs. They're not doing the fats. They're like having a problem with all fuel sources. So that's how you rectify the paradox. And all you're seeing is in the lean mass hyperresponder, right? They're just really good at using the fats now. So they're like, all their systems are geared towards oxidizing fatty acid substrate. On the high carb diet, the systems are geared toward oxidizing carbohydrate substrate. And the person who has a problem, their system is just trying to figure out like, what can we oxidize here? Because like nothing's working. So everything
you get it back up.
Exactly. Carbs are backed up. Insulin's high. Fats are backed up. Glucagon's high. And it's like the whole system is dysregulated because what's happened is you have this system where you have hormones are trying to gauge what's going on at the peripherals. Like the body's trying to gauge and signal with hormones what's going on at the cells, what's going on inside the bloodstream, what's going on at the liver, and then what's going on from the gut and all this type of stuff. But what's happening is the cells are like full, but they don't have energy. They're filled with fuel, but they're not turning it to energy. Then the bloodstream is filled with fuel and the cells are calling for energy. And then the liver is filled with fuel and it's still calling for energy. So you have this weird hodgepodge of, we have all this fuel, but we can't do anything with it. And we're still signaling for the fuel because we're fundamentally at an energy deficit. And so that's where you get then the whole system's deranged. like the signaling gets deranged between insulin and glucagon. The signaling is deranged between release of free fatty acids and shutting off of fatty acids and production of glucose from the liver and the amount of glucose that's already in the bloodstream. And the ATP levels are all just, the mitochondria are under pressure. There's not enough ATP, but there's a lot of fuel floating around. So things are broken. And so there's a lot of steps that have to go to getting things back on track. And a lot of that, then what happens is the body's like, all right, we're going to put this in storage. And that's where you see people they shove it in storage, shove it in storage, shove it in storage. And at a certain point, it's like, only have so much storage to some extent. And you start leaking all the fuel sources out of that storage. And you have all this inflammatory mediators because the fats amplify that inflammatory response. And so then you have like, at that point, now you've maxed out storage. You're leaking all the fuel substrate in, nothing's being used, and the pipelines are getting backed up. And then since metabolism is messed up, ATP generation is not good, then you're starting to see oxidative stress with the fuel. And so it's like you like have a fire lit in your pipeline with all your fuel sources present. So these create this is where the problem lies, is in this. And that's why it's like you need to fix the diet and you need to fix what's going on with metabolism so that you can get this. Food comes in, digest it, liver distributes it, cells use it. Instead of food comes in, digest it, liver doesn't know what to do with it, tries to distribute it, and cells don't know what to do with it. And then it's still stuck in distribution. And then the liver gets it back. And it's like, I just sent this out.
You're taking all these factors to consider within the diet in terms of how to structure it, what food sources, ratios, supplements to bring on board, lifestyle implementation stuff to correct that problem, to push towards being able to oxidize the fuel sources. Primarily, you would say glucose is probably the one you want to shoot for. So those strategies will be enhancing that. And that's not a ketogenic diet, a low carb diet, or anything along the restrictive side, right?
It's not like a diet, like this is the diet. It's like, what does this person as an individual need given their context to get the outcome? And then, so say, to answer your question specifically, say you had a lean mass hyperresponder and everything was going well, like all their markers look good and things like are going well overall. Like, okay, like I'm not saying you have to switch to a higher carb diet. It's just from my personal perspective, my understanding of reading the research, right? I think it's better to have glucagon lower. I think it's better glucagon metabolism levels. I think it's better to have cortisol lower. I think it's better to not have the changes that happen in the mitochondria with fat oxidation as the primary way of oxidizing. You're always oxidizing carbs and fats. It's just a slider as far as percentage. I think it's better to be oxidizing carbs more so than fats based on what happens in my understanding of what goes on in the mitochondria. I think it's better to have a higher CO2 concentration based on Bohr and Haldane effects than if you're doing the fatty acids. I think you can have a more nutrient-dense diet in general if you have the carbohydrate sources and if your major energy source is butter or olive oil or something like this. And I think it's better from a microbiome standpoint to not dump in tons of fats all the time into the GI tract and things like this. So like I have my reasons on, like I have my bunch of rationales on why I think carbs trump fats. But if somebody is doing well on that diet, I'm not sitting here saying every single person needs to be on this. It's like from my perspective and my understanding of the physiology and what I'm seeing with clients and these different components, I think that the carb oxidation is what I would prioritize. I think the insulin signaling and the effects on thyroid hormone, the effects on androgens, the effects on glucagon, the effects on the mitochondrial changes of microbiome, CO2 levels, I think that fundamentally, the NAD plus to NADH ratio, that to me would indicate that carbohydrate metabolism would be better than fatty acid oxidation. That's my perspective. I'm adjusting based on the outcome. People have come at me and they're like, well, keto or carnivore is the best. It's like, I don't care what diet you're doing. It's not personal for me whether you're in this camp or that camp. Like, it's irrelevant. It's like, what do you need to do to get your outcome to function better? And how can I help you to do that?
So we covered a lot of the questions from the community within our discussions talking about the clips, but there's a few that we didn't get to. So I want to just shoot these off at you real quick and then get your thoughts. The first one that we have is, what are your thoughts on cholesterol lowering supplements, specifically red yeast rice?
Yeah, this is a good one. I mean, the fungus that produces lovastatin in it. I can't tell anybody not to take a statin, but I think that there would be some concerns with using a statin because you're blocking this whole pathway, malevolent pathway, which is involved in the production of a variety of different components. By blocking this pathway, you're also blocking a bunch of other things that in the long term could potentially be problematic. And that's why I think there's potential concerns. And there are known side effects with statins like myopathy, insulin resistance, and risks like this, or associations at least with insulin resistance and diabetes in some of the studies, increased risks of infection, stuff like this. So you have to be careful with what mechanism you're looking at. Even though it lowers cholesterol, it can have other downstream effects. Also, statins have other effects beyond that. So the red yeast rice, I'm not a personal fan of because it's similar to a statin. And if you're on a statin, you probably don't want to be taking red yeast rice on top of a statin because you're kind of doubling up on the same mechanism. So I would avoid red yeast rice as an option.
Okay, let's jump into the last question here. Why can infections in the gut or infections in general present as high cholesterol?
When the immune system gets activated, it releases a bunch of components called cytokines and inflammatory molecules, or cell signaling molecules. So some of them, like tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukin 6, increase the production of cholesterol at the liver. So you get it will raise LDL, total cholesterol, and things like this. Why? Because the lipids bind to endotoxin and then they get brought back to the liver, and then the cells in the liver can actually start to detoxify those toxins. So it's kind of like a mopping up effect. So the cholesterol goes and helps it's involved with the immune response, and it's involved with detoxifying some of the toxic components. So it'll bump that up. So chronic low-grade inflammation or low-grade infections can drive up lipid panels by increasing these cytokines. That will increase the cholesterol values overall and also alter the metabolism of the cholesterol peripherally by adjusting its uptake and utilization at the cells. So there's a lot of ways in which the immune stimulus from infections can lead to the elevated lipids. So
it's like a protective effect, essentially. And that would maybe another thing to consider when you're talking about lowering cholesterol pharmacologically is like the cholesterol is there to protect against infections and things like this, right?
If you have an infection and then you're just nuking your cholesterol levels, like that could potentially not be a good idea. And if it's like really high, we see these strong associations. So like the risk is worth the reward to like smash things down. But for me, the question is like, can I lower it in a way that doesn't increase the risk with the pharma stuff? And there is some side effects and risks with the pharma stuff, that's what I talked about on the podcast with Paul.
And there's, I think, a litany of things to try before you go that route that we discussed in this podcast. I think we covered quite a bit here. So is there anything you want to finish up with before we wrap up?
Try to see the levers that you have at your disposal. You have pharma, you have supplements, you have diet, you have exercise, and try to pull all the levers to improve your health and get the outcomes that you're looking for. I think that's what I'm looking at. And then try to figure out what is specifically going on in your circumstance and get that under control instead of like looking for this, well, it's keto, it's bioenergetic, it's carnivore, it's vegan. It's like you may have something very specific going on and you're going to take a world tour of diets and supplements and whatever else instead of saying like, okay, like what, like taking stock and saying like, where are my specific issues for me? And then trying to address those.
And if anybody's interested in working with you or checking out what else you have going on in terms of YouTube, socials and stuff, where can they find you?
Of course, they can find me here on the podcast. Right. They can find me on the YouTube channel, Mike Fave, just Mike Fave YouTube, and the website, as always, mikefave.com. And what about you, Ethan? Where can everybody find you?
So it's Ethan_Wright on Twitter and Instagram. That's usually where I'm hanging out. So you can find me there. And then again, if anybody has any topics they'd like to see us discuss in the future, please leave them in the comments. We'll get to them. And with that said, we'll catch you guys next week.
Yep. Catch you next week.
All right.